The cold was relentless, an unyielding force that had wrapped the landscape in a frozen stranglehold. Snowflakes, driven by the howling wind, danced furiously against the slate-gray sky, forming a thick, icy blanket on the ground. Visibility was near zero, and the world seemed shrouded in a swirling haze of white. It was in this unforgiving environment that the young dog found itself, a speck of life struggling against nature's overwhelming force. The dog's fur, a mottled mix of tawny brown and cream, was crusted with ice, the individual strands matted together as the biting wind carried tiny shards of frost that pierced its coat like needles. Its breath came in rapid, shallow puffs, each exhalation crystallizing in the freezing air before vanishing into nothingness. The normally sharp, attentive eyes were now dull, clouded with fatigue and desperation. The animal's paws, once sure and steady, left faltering tracks in the deep snow, each step a battle against the numbing cold that threatened to sap the strength from its limbs. It had been separated from its pack, or perhaps its owner, hours, or maybe even days ago. Time had blurred into a continuous haze of survival, the dog driven forward by the primal urge to find shelter, food, or some semblance of warmth. But the storm was unyielding, its fury showing no sign of abating. Every gust of wind felt like a physical blow, pushing the dog back, as if nature itself was determined to break the fragile creature. Its hunger was a gnawing, all-encompassing pain. The dog's ribs were beginning to show beneath its fur, each breath emphasizing the hollowness of its body. It had tried to forage, scraping at the snow-covered ground in vain attempts to uncover some buried morsel, but the earth beneath was frozen solid, offering no solace. Its nose, usually its most reliable tool for navigating the world, was nearly numb, the scent of life obscured by the overwhelming sterility of snow and ice. The dog staggered, its gait uneven as exhaustion took its toll. It had crossed fields, trudged through forests now unrecognizable under the weight of snow, and clambered over jagged rocks coated in a treacherous layer of ice. Each movement was a monumental effort, its body trembling violently with every step. Its paws were raw, the pads cracked and bleeding from the constant abrasion against the harsh terrain. A faint trail of crimson marked its path, though it would quickly be buried under fresh snow, leaving no trace of the dog's desperate journey. As the storm intensified, the dog's movements grew slower, its body hunched low against the ground in a futile attempt to shield itself from the wind. It wasn't just the physical strain that was taking a toll, there was a deep, primal fear gnawing at the edges of the dog's mind. Alone, without the warmth and guidance of its pack or the reassuring presence of its owner, it was vulnerable in a way that went beyond physical weakness. The instincts that had carried it this far were beginning to falter, the natural resilience giving way to the creeping despair that came with knowing there was no help in sight. Finally, the dog stumbled. Its legs gave out beneath it, and it collapsed into the snow, its body sinking slightly into the powdery surface. For a moment, it tried to rise, its front legs scrabbling feebly at the ground, but the effort was too much. With a defeated whimper, it let its head fall, resting against the icy surface. Its breath was slow now, each exhalation weaker than the last, the rhythm of its chest rising and falling becoming more erratic. The world around it was eerily silent save for the howling of the wind. Snowflakes settled on its body, beginning to obscure its form, as if nature intended to claim it entirely. Its ears twitched faintly at the distant sound of cracking branches, the faintest suggestion of movement somewhere beyond the storm, but it lacked the energy to react. The dog's eyes fluttered closed, its body trembling one last time before going still, a fragile flicker of life barely clinging on amidst the storm's relentless onslaught. In that moment, the dog's world was reduced to a single, overwhelming sensation: cold. It was an all-encompassing presence, a force that seeped into its very core, extinguishing the warmth of life little by little. Alone, lost, and on the verge of surrender, the dog lay there, a small, vulnerable creature at the mercy of a merciless world. The storm raged on, indifferent to the quiet tragedy unfolding beneath its furious gaze. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its warmth spreading sluggishly through the small wooden cabin. The air inside was heavy with the mingled scents of damp fur and charred wood. Jack crouched on the floor, his knees aching from the cold that had seeped into his bones during the trek. In front of him, the dog lay limp on a patchwork blanket he'd laid out, its chest rising and falling so faintly that Jack caught himself leaning in close to check it was still alive. "Come on, don't quit on me now," Jack murmured, his voice hoarse from the storm's brutal wind. His hands moved with a mix of desperation and precision, rough fingers working the dog's limbs in firm but careful motions, trying to coax warmth back into its body. He'd read about this somewhere long ago, how to restore circulation when someone was near frozen, but he'd never thought he'd have to put it into practice, and certainly not on a half-dead dog in the middle of nowhere. The dog's fur was matted and stiff with ice, patches of frostbite discoloring its paws and ears. Jack winced as his fingers brushed the worst of it. He couldn't imagine the pain the animal must have endured out there, alone in the storm. The humiliation of it, being abandoned, left to fend for itself against nature's merciless grip. Jack understood that feeling all too well. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind outside. Jack hated the quiet, hated the way it gave his thoughts room to creep in. He focused harder on the dog, rubbing its legs to keep himself grounded. He felt the faintest twitch beneath his hands, a small, almost imperceptible movement that made his chest tighten. The dog was fighting. It wasn't giving up, not yet. "You're tougher than you look," Jack said softly, his voice carrying a note of admiration despite himself. "Bet you've been through worse, huh? You've got that look about you." The dog didn't respond, of course, but Jack kept talking. The sound of his own voice was strangely comforting, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this frozen wilderness. He told the dog about the firewood he'd chopped that morning, the blizzard that had caught him off guard, the long, grueling hike to and from the trading post. He even muttered a few choice words about the storm, calling it every curse he could think of. The words felt hollow, but they filled the space between his thoughts and the silence. When the dog finally stirred, a small, feeble movement that barely shifted its position, Jack froze. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, but then it happened again. A slight twitch of its hind leg, a flicker of its eyelids. Relief flooded through him, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "There you are," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Thought I'd lost you for a second." He reached for the bowl of lukewarm broth he'd prepared earlier and carefully tilted it toward the dog's mouth. The animal didn't move at first, but when Jack dipped his fingers into the liquid and brought them to its lips, the dog's tongue flicked out, weakly lapping at the broth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jack hope. "Good," he said, his tone encouraging. "That's good. Keep going." The process was painstakingly slow. Jack alternated between feeding the dog tiny amounts of broth and massaging its limbs to keep the blood flowing. His hands ached from the cold and the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The memory of the dog lying in the snow, half-buried and lifeless, was burned into his mind. He refused to let that be the end. Hours passed, the storm outside showing no signs of relenting. Jack's cabin, though sturdy, groaned under the weight of the snow piling up on the roof. The wind screamed through the cracks in the window frames, and the temperature inside hovered just above freezing despite the fire's best efforts. Jack added more wood to the hearth, watching the flames leap higher. The light flickered across the dog's thin frame, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. It was a pitiful sight, the animal's ribs clearly visible beneath its matted fur, its body trembling as it fought to stay alive. Jack felt a pang of guilt as he looked at it. He'd been so close to walking away, so close to leaving it behind in the snow. It would have been easier, safer, less complicated. But as he watched the dog now, struggling to hold on against all odds, he knew he couldn't have lived with himself if he'd left it there to die. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that," Jack said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe we've got that in common." The dog's eyes opened briefly, just a sliver of dark brown visible beneath heavy lids. Jack's breath caught. It was the first real sign of life he'd seen since he'd found it. The moment was fleeting. The dog's eyes closed again almost immediately, but it was enough to stir something deep inside Jack, something he thought he'd buried long ago. He sat back on his heels, his legs numb from kneeling on the floor for so long. The firelight played across his face, highlighting the lines etched deep into his skin, marks of a life spent carrying burdens he couldn't let go of. As he stared at the dog, wrapped in the blanket and slowly, painfully regaining strength, Jack felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a gnawing fear that he'd taken on more than he could handle. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, though there was no malice in his tone. "I'm not exactly good at this kind of thing." The dog didn't respond, of course, but Jack felt the weight of his own words settle heavily in the room. He wasn't good at this, at caring, at letting people or things into his life. The mountain was supposed to be his refuge, a place where he could escape the mess of the world and the people in it. And yet, here he was, tending to a half-frozen dog like it was the most important thing in the world. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew he couldn't go back to the way things were, not now. The dog's survival had become his responsibility, and whether he liked it or not, he was invested. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest flicker of connection, of purpose, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the losses that had driven him to the mountains in the first place. As the hours dragged on and the storm raged outside, Jack stayed by the fire, keeping watch over the fragile life he'd rescued. The dog's breathing grew steadier, its trembling less pronounced. It wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but it was alive. And for Jack, in that moment, that was enough. The night was oppressive, suffocatingly dark. Outside the cabin, the blizzard had eased, leaving a stillness in its wake, but it was the kind of stillness that carried a warning. Jack sat slouched in his creaking wooden chair, his rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. His eyes were heavy, the exhaustion of the long day pulling at him, but he didn't dare sleep. The dog, lying by the fire, stirred faintly, its breathing more regular now but still labored. Jack glanced at it, the frail creature barely more than a shadow of life. The blanket wrapped around it rose and fell with a rhythm that reassured him in a way he didn't want to admit. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and running a hand down his weathered face. The adrenaline that had carried him through the storm and the grueling effort of saving the dog was wearing off, leaving behind a gnawing unease. Something about the quiet outside unsettled him. The storm had masked the usual sounds of the mountain, but now, with the wind gone, every creak of the cabin and groan of the settling snow seemed louder, sharper. Jack's instincts told him he wasn't alone. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible noise that sent a chill racing down his spine. A low growl, carried on the still night air. Jack froze, his hand hovering near the rifle. His eyes darted to the window, but the frost coating the glass made it impossible to see anything clearly. He strained his ears, listening. There it was again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of paws crunching softly through the snow, deliberate and measured. Jack's jaw tightened, and he reached for the rifle, his fingers curling around the cold metal. He stood slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved toward the window. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned close, squinting into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, just the faint outline of trees against the black sky. But then a shadow moved, quick, sleek, and low to the ground. And then another. His stomach sank. They were circling the cabin, their movements cautious but purposeful. Jack counted 3, maybe 4, their shapes barely visible as they wove through the trees. The largest of them stepped into the clearing in front of the cabin, its silver-gray coat catching the faint light of the moon. Its head was low, its yellow eyes locked on the cabin, unblinking and predatory. It let out a low, rumbling growl, and Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The dog by the fire let out a faint whimper, its ears twitching as if it sensed the danger outside. Jack turned toward it, his heart twisting at the sound. The dog was too weak to move, let alone defend itself, and if the wolves decided to test the cabin's defenses, the dog wouldn't stand a chance. Neither would Jack if he wasn't careful. He moved quickly, checking the bolt on the door and the shutters on the windows. The cabin was sturdy, built to withstand the harsh mountain winters, but it wasn't impenetrable. A determined pack of wolves could break through if they wanted to. Jack knew he had to act fast. He grabbed his rifle and a box of ammunition, loading it with practiced efficiency. The weight of the gun in his hands was both comforting and sobering. He'd used it plenty of times to hunt, but this was different. This wasn't about survival or food. This was about protection, about making sure the dog didn't end up as prey. Jack stepped to the door, his breath steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. He cracked it open just enough to peer outside, the frigid air stinging his face. The lead wolf was closer now, its breath visible in the cold night as it stood just yards from the porch. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence and hunger, and behind it, the rest of the pack lingered, their silhouettes shifting restlessly. Jack stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching loudly on the wooden planks. He raised the rifle, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Get out of here," he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a whip. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing through the valley. The wolves flinched at the sound, their ears flattening against their heads, but they didn't retreat. The lead wolf bared its teeth, a low snarl rumbling from its throat. Jack could see the tension in its body, the way it crouched low, ready to pounce. "Don't even think about it," Jack growled, leveling the rifle at the wolf. His voice was firm, commanding, but he knew it wasn't enough. Wolves weren't easily intimidated, especially not when they were hungry. He had to make them believe that coming any closer would cost them dearly. The wolf took a step forward, its paws sinking into the snow. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired another shot, this time aiming at the ground just in front of the animal. The snow exploded in a spray of white, and the wolf yelped, skittering back. The rest of the pack shifted uneasily, their growls filling the air as they tried to decide whether to fight or flee. Jack took a step forward, his presence as much a weapon as the rifle in his hands. "Get!" he shouted, his voice booming. He swung the rifle toward the pack, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You don't want this fight." For a moment, the wolves hesitated, their instincts warring with their hunger. The lead wolf snarled again, its muscles coiled like a spring, but Jack didn't back down. He held his ground, his gaze locked with the animals, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead wolf let out a sharp bark and turned, disappearing into the shadows. One by one, the others followed, their shapes melting into the darkness until the clearing was empty once more. Jack lowered the rifle slowly, his breath coming in heavy bursts. He stayed on the porch for a long moment, listening to the silence that followed, his ears straining for any sign that the wolves might return. But the night remained still. When Jack finally stepped back inside, the warmth of the cabin hit him like a wall. The dog was still lying by the fire, its eyes half open and its body trembling faintly. Jack set the rifle down and knelt beside it, his hands shaking as he reached out to check its bandaged paws. "They're gone," he said softly, his voice rough but gentle. "You're safe now." The dog's eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time, Jack saw something in its gaze that wasn't fear or pain. It was trust, a fragile, tentative trust that made Jack's chest tighten. He sat back, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the night's events caught up to him. The wolves were gone, but the danger wasn't over. Out here, survival was a constant battle, and Jack knew he couldn't let his guard down. But for now, in the quiet glow of the fire, he allowed himself a moment of relief. The dog was alive, the cabin was intact, and the wolves were nothing more than shadows in the snow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The following morning was bitterly cold, the sunlight barely cutting through the dense clouds that hung low over the mountains. Jack had barely slept, his body tense and his mind racing. The events of the previous night had left him rattled, and though the wolves had retreated, their presence lingered in his thoughts like a shadow. He sat by the fire, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, staring at the dog lying on the blanket. It was still weak, but its breathing was stronger now, its sides rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Jack had done what he could, but it wasn't out of danger yet. He glanced toward the window, his eyes narrowing. Something was off. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that warned of trouble. Jack set his mug down and stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his rifle. He stepped to the window and peered out, his breath fogging the glass. At first, he saw nothing but the snow-covered clearing and the dark outline of the trees. But then a flicker of movement caught his eye, a figure on horseback, emerging from the forest. Jack's stomach tightened. Another rider appeared behind the first, then another. There were 3 of them, all bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats. They moved slowly, scanning the area with a deliberate intent that set Jack's nerves on edge. He didn't recognize them, but that didn't mean much. People rarely came this far into the mountains unless they had a purpose, and Jack doubted these men were out here for a leisurely ride. He cursed under his breath, his mind racing. They could be hunters, trappers, or simply travelers, but there was something about the way they moved, so methodical, so focused, that made him suspect otherwise. Maybe they were searching for something, or someone. And if they found the dog, Jack had no doubt they'd take it, or worse. The dog let out a faint whimper, shifting on the blanket. Jack turned toward it, his expression hardening. "Quiet," he muttered, though his voice lacked any real sternness. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't make another sound. Jack grabbed his coat and slipped it on, his movements brisk and efficient. He tucked his rifle under his arm and stepped toward the door, pausing only to glance back at the dog. "Stay put," he said, as if the animal could understand him. Then he opened the door and stepped outside, the cold biting into his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The riders were closer now, their horses' hooves crunching softly in the snow. Jack stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the powder as he moved to meet them. He kept his rifle angled downward, not wanting to appear overtly hostile but making it clear he was armed. The lead rider spotted him and raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. They pulled their horses to a halt a few yards away, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Morning," the lead rider called, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a posture that suggested he was used to being in charge. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Jack with a penetrating intensity. "Morning," Jack replied, his tone neutral. He kept his grip on the rifle steady, his gaze flicking briefly to the other 2 riders. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, was scanning the cabin, his expression unreadable. The third rider, younger and less imposing, seemed nervous, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. "Didn't expect to find anyone out this way," the lead rider said, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "You live here?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. Cabin's mine. Been here a while." The man tilted his head slightly, as if weighing Jack's words. "We're looking for a stray," he said after a moment. "Big dog, maybe passed through here recently. You seen anything?" Jack's stomach clenched, but he didn't let it show. He shook his head, his expression carefully blank. "Haven't seen a thing. Storm was too bad last night to see much of anything." The scarred rider narrowed his eyes, his gaze shifting back to the cabin. "You sure about that? Looks like you've been busy in there." Jack's jaw tightened. "Just keeping the fire going. Storm like that, you don't take chances." The lead rider studied Jack for a long moment, his eyes flicking briefly to the rifle. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked, his tone deceptively polite. "Could be the dog's holed up somewhere nearby." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. He forced himself to appear calm, but his mind was racing. If they came inside, they'd find the dog. There was no way to hide it, it was too weak to move, and the cabin was too small. But if he refused, it would only make them more suspicious. "Don't see why you need to," Jack said evenly. "Ain't nothing here but me and the storm. If the dog's smart, it kept moving. Wolves out here don't give second chances." The younger rider shifted in his saddle, glancing nervously at the others. The scarred man frowned, his hand drifting toward the rifle slung across his back. The lead rider, however, didn't move. He studied Jack for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "But if you see anything, you let us know. That dog's important." Jack didn't respond. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The lead rider turned his horse, gesturing for the others to follow. They hesitated for a moment, but eventually complied, their horses plodding through the snow as they disappeared back into the forest. Jack stood there for a long moment, his breath coming in slow, measured bursts. His body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. He didn't move until the riders were completely out of sight, their shapes swallowed by the trees. When he finally stepped back inside, the cabin felt stiflingly warm compared to the freezing air outside. He closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment as he collected himself. The dog stirred on the blanket, its eyes half open, watching him with a faint flicker of awareness. "They're gone," Jack said, his voice rough. He set the rifle down and knelt beside the dog, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the blanket around its fragile body. "But they'll be back. You need to get better, fast." The dog didn't respond, but its eyes lingered on him, filled with a mixture of exhaustion and trust. Jack let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know who those men were or why they were so interested in the dog, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them take it. Not after everything it had been through. Not after everything he'd been through. The days stretched on, marked by a heavy tension that lingered like the mountains biting cold. Jack kept his rifle close, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the riders. The dog, slowly regaining its strength, was a quiet presence in the cabin. Its once lifeless body had begun to fill out as Jack fed it scraps of meat and broth, its coat regaining a faint sheen despite the patches of frostbite that left permanent scars. It could stand now, albeit shakily, and each tentative step felt like a small victory. But with the dog's recovery came a growing unease for Jack, a reminder that he couldn't keep it forever. Jack wasn't sure why the thought unsettled him so much. Maybe it was the way the dog followed him with its eyes, silent and watchful, as if waiting for something. Or the way it limped to his side whenever he moved, resting its head against his leg as though it belonged there. Jack didn't want this, didn't want the weight of caring for another living thing. It felt like a tether, a risk he couldn't afford to take. He'd come to the mountains to escape, to live without the ties that had once bound him so tightly they'd nearly broken him. The dog didn't belong in this life, and neither did the quiet, creeping sense of attachment it stirred in him. One cold morning, Jack decided it was time. The dog was strong enough to survive on its own now. Its wounds had healed, and while it still carried the marks of its ordeal, Jack knew it was better off in the wild. He wrapped his coat tightly around himself and whistled softly, motioning for the dog to follow him. The animal rose slowly, its movements still a little stiff, and padded after him without hesitation. Jack grabbed his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder, and stepped out into the snow. The forest was silent, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frost. Jack led the dog deep into the woods, his boots crunching through the snow with a deliberate rhythm. The dog trailed behind him, its ears pricking at every sound, its nose twitching as it took in the unfamiliar scents. Jack didn't speak. His jaw was set, his thoughts a tangled mess of resolve and something he refused to name, something that felt too much like guilt. When they reached a clearing, Jack stopped. The sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows on the snow. He turned to the dog, his expression hard. "This is it," he said, his voice rough. He knelt down, meeting the dog's gaze. "You're free now. Go on." The dog tilted its head, its ears flicking forward. It didn't move. Jack sighed, running a hand over his face. "You don't belong here," he muttered. "You're better off out there." He gestured toward the woods, his movements sharp, almost impatient. "Go." The dog hesitated, its dark eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, it turned and began to walk away, its head low, its tail dragging in the snow. Jack watched it go, his chest tightening with each step it took. He told himself it was for the best, that the dog would find its place out here, where it belonged. He turned away before it disappeared entirely, heading back toward the cabin with heavy steps. But when he reached the porch and turned to close the door, the dog was there. Jack froze, his hand gripping the doorknob. The animal stood at the edge of the clearing, its body still and its eyes locked on him. It didn't bark or whine, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. "Go back," Jack said, his voice harsher than he intended. He waved a hand at the dog, trying to shoo it away. "I'm not doing this. You hear me? Go." The dog didn't move. Jack slammed the door shut, leaning his back against it as he let out a frustrated breath. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a mix of anger and something he couldn't quite name. Why wouldn't it leave? Why couldn't it just go and let him be? He'd done his part, he'd saved it, healed it. He owed it nothing, and it owed him nothing in return. But when Jack opened the door an hour later to chop wood, the dog was still there. It had settled on the porch, its body curled into a tight ball against the cold. It raised its head when it saw him, its ears twitching, but it didn't approach. Jack stared at it for a long moment, his thoughts a chaotic storm. He felt trapped, cornered by his own reluctant compassion. "Stupid mutt," he muttered, grabbing his axe and stomping down the steps. He swung at the logs with more force than necessary, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing through the clearing. The dog watched him silently, its dark eyes unblinking. Jack ignored it or tried to. But by the time he finished and carried the wood back inside, he found himself leaving the door open just a crack. The days passed and the dog stayed. Jack tried again to chase it off, leading it even deeper into the woods, but it always returned, stubborn and unyielding. Eventually he stopped trying. The dog had made its choice, and Jack, despite himself, couldn't bring himself to fight it anymore. The change was slow, almost imperceptible. The dog began following him everywhere, into the woods when he chopped firewood, to the stream when he gathered water, even to the edge of the clearing when he hunted. It learned to stay quiet, to move carefully, as though it understood the unspoken rules of Jack's solitary life. And Jack, despite his initial resistance, found himself talking to it more and more, his gruff voice filling the quiet spaces in a way that felt strangely natural. "You're not as useless as I thought," he said one evening, watching as the dog nosed at the firewood he'd stacked by the hearth. It wagged its tail faintly, a small, tentative movement that made Jack's chest ache. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still stubborn though." The dog's presence began to shift something inside Jack, something he'd thought was long dead. It wasn't just companionship, it was purpose. Caring for the dog, teaching it, watching it grow stronger, it gave him a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep moving forward. The cabin felt less empty, the mountain less cold. And for the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to feel something he hadn't dared to in a long time, hope. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered peaks, Jack stood on the porch with the dog by his side. The air was sharp and clear, carrying the faint scent of pine. Jack looked down at the animal, its coat gleaming in the light, its eyes bright and steady. "Guess you're sticking around," he said, his voice soft. The dog wagged its tail, a small, quiet affirmation. Jack nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the one he needed.